Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
I should like to speak about the challenge of the Akedah. The Akedah, or binding, refers most specifically to Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19, the passage in the Torah that tells of Abraham's willingness to obey God's command to sacrifice his beloved son and sole heir, Isaac. Until, that is, God calls the sacrifice off at the last minute and promises great reward to Abraham for his extraordinary act of obedience. In its broader sense, the Akedah refers to the rich set of echoes, elaborations, applications, and reflections upon this passage in the Jewish tradition over the centuries. The text has also proven influential in Christianity and Islam, each in its own way. Christians tend to term this narrative the sacrifice of Isaac, though of course Isaac is not in the end sacrificed, whereas Jews call it the binding of Isaac after the verb v'ya'akod in verse 9, in which Abraham ties his son up before placing him upon the altar. It would be hard to underestimate just how challenging this text is, and for practitioners of Judaism, it is also hard to avoid it. The Akedah is, of course, publicly chanted in the weekly Torah reading, the Parashat HaShavua, in October or November every year, and at a certain point it became the Torah reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the fall New Year's festival as well. In many Sidurim or prayer books, it even appears in the morning service every day of the year. Few passages in the Jewish tradition have been more central or more generative, and fewer, if any, are more painful. The source of the pain is obvious. A father is commanded to make the son whom he is explicitly said to love into a burnt offering, that is, to turn him into smoke so that all that remains of him are the ashes. And the loving father obeys. Confronted with such a painful narrative, who would not seek, at least at first, to neutralize the pain? Some do so simply by condemning Abraham. He didn't pass the test, they say. He failed it by proving willing to carry out a gruesome murder of an innocent person. Others tried to avoid the challenge of the Akedah by making this wrenching and exquisitely constructed little narrative into just a milestone in the ethical development of humankind deep in hoary antiquity. Seizing on the fact that in the end God calls the sacrifice off, they see the narrative as intending to outlaw child sacrifice. The message is thus something every sane person now knows. Don't immolate your child, even if you somehow imagine God wants you to. Whoa, not much of a challenge there for us. Often this interpretation involves a pejorative contrast with other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Leaving aside the question of the accuracy of that characterization, we can still see that what this reading does is to replace the pain that the Akedah evokes in us with pride and self-congratulation. Our ancestors were the first to perceive what all civilized people now take to be a truism. The problems with such an interpretation are severe. For one, it is odd that the narrative begins with God's commanding exactly what the text has supposedly come to forbid. Actually, in the text, there is no prohibition at all upon child sacrifice. The issue doesn't come up. For another, Abraham is richly rewarded for his willingness to obey God's command. God now cites Abraham's obedience as the ground for the promises he had made to him. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored or special son, I will bestow my blessings upon you. My blessing upon you, verse 17. It is of course true that the Torah forbids child sacrifice in general, and some of the prophets regard it as emblematic of the most depraved idolatry. But this makes it all the more curious that the prophets never mention the Akedah. If they knew of this text and understood it to be a condemnation of the hated practice, why did they not utilize it in their own polemics? Finally, we should note that in the main, the Jewish tradition over the centuries has not condemned, but rather celebrated Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his beloved son. I think, for example, of the Midrash in which, after offering the ram that substitutes for Isaac, Abraham offers this prayer: Sovereign of the universe, regard the blood of this ram as if it were the blood of my son Isaac, and the entrails of this ram as if they were the entrails of my son Isaac. Indeed, in traditional Jewish sources, the Akedah is often understood to have established a reservoir of grace upon which the people Israel may draw when they are in danger, including the danger that comes from their own sins. One sage in the Talmud thus interprets God to have said, blow the ram's horn, referring to the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, before me, so that I may remember for your benefit the binding of Isaac, and I will account it to you as if you had bound yourselves before me. In my view, the Akedah is not about child sacrifice at all. It is not for it or against it, but it is very much about sacrifice. In the Bible, sacrifice is not primarily about killing. There are, for example, vegetal sacrifices that do not involve bloodshed at all. Rather, the key element of sacrifice is the presentation of the offering, the act of bringing it near, as suggested by the Hebrew verb hikriv, in an act of submission and homage to the divine recipient. In Abraham's case, the designated offering is to be nothing less than the son who represents God's promise to him, a promise that is literally at the center of Abraham's life. For as the biblical chronology would have it, Abraham lives 175 years. He lives the first 75 without the promise that he will father a great nation. When he's 100, Sarah, his aged and always infertile wife, miraculously bears him Isaac, the tangible proof that the seemingly absurd promise was credible after all, and Abraham's faith was not misplaced. But what about that agonizing middle set of 25 years, when the promise has been given, but the fulfillment, year after year, fails to arrive? It is a return to that excruciating condition that the Akedah threatens to bring about, except now the situation will be even worse, because God will have counteracted his own promise, leaving the obedient Abraham with nothing. In a sense, this also restores Abraham to where he stood at the beginning of the journey. The man who had to break with his father in chapter 12 now must break with his son in chapter 22. It is hardly coincidental, in my judgment, that these are the only two instances in the Bible in which we find the words lech lecha, go forth. The first time Abraham is to go forth, it is in response to God's promise of fabulous things ahead for him. He will be richly blessed, become a great nation, and acquire a great name. And as reported a few verses later, his descendants will be granted a whole country. Not bad. Who could turn that down? But the second time he's told to go forth, at the outset of the Akedah, it is not to receive, but to give. Not to acquire, but to renounce. Not to multiply, but to subtract. Who could respond to that with obedience? Yet Abraham did. In Jubilees, an important Jewish book from the 2nd century BCE that is not part of our scriptural canon, we find the Akedah retold with a prologue that is modeled on the first two chapters of the book of Job, another biblical text about an excruciating test. Here, Abraham must choose between the love of Isaac, with whom he's more pleased than everything else, and his love of and faithfulness to God. A painful choice, but true sacrifice is painful. It is not a matter of decluttering our lives of things we don't need anyway, or can easily live without. It is costly, and its costliness reveals the depth of our commitment and what it is that we regard as ultimate. Centuries later, a rabbinic midrash imagines a similar scene, this time with the ministering angels rather than a demonic accuser raising the issue. This fellow Abraham was happy and made other people happy, they say, apparently speaking about the huge feast he had given in honor of Isaac's weaning in the previous chapter. But he has not set aside for the Holy One, blessed be he, a single bull or a single ram. Said God in reply, even if we told him to sacrifice his own son to me, he would not refuse. Here again, the Akedah is understood as a choice between self-aggrandizement and self-giving, or in the language of Genesis 22 itself, between withholding the son and offering the son. With this, we come to the paradox that I think is key to the interpretation of the Akedah. Our possessions are legitimately ours to the extent that we recognize them as gifts and are thus prepared to return them to their ultimate owner. Abraham retains Isaac and the promise that rests upon him and him alone, precisely because, as the text twice tells us, he did not withhold him. He passes the test and proves his fear of God, that is, his attentiveness to the divine command, by being willing to give up his beloved son. Once he has done so, it would be pointless to continue the test, and the sacrifice is called off. The father who had not withheld the ultimate gift receives the old blessings and promises anew, except they are no longer pure gifts. His willingness to sacrifice demonstrates that to some degree he now deserves them. But what about Isaac? Here it bears mention that in a number of Second Temple and rabbinic texts, Isaac is as much the hero of the Akedah as Abraham. He is presented as a willing and witting participant in the commanded sacrifice. In a word, Isaac becomes a martyr, a person who, presented with the horrible choice between death and faithlessness to God, chooses death. Martyrdom was sadly a reality to some Jews in those periods and others later, and Isaac's act of self-sacrifice surely bolstered their courage in the challenge they faced. A few moments ago, I referred to the rabbinic idea prominent in the liturgy that the Akedah established a reservoir of grace upon which the people Israel can draw when their own deeds are lacking. Never is this more the case than in the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, inclusively, when we are, as it were, on trial, and let's be clear, also guilty. Ein banu ma'asim. We have no deeds to plead in our behalf. Our hope lies not in our own record, but in God's generosity and kindness, tzedakah v'chesed. But here again, divine grace is not the whole story. We also engage in the difficult psycho-spiritual process of tshuva, repentance, in which we confess our individual and communal sins and ask God's help in mending our ways and proving worthy of our relationship with Him to some degree. And we remind Him of His irrevocable promises to our ancestors and of the Akedah, the profound little passage in which Abraham and Isaac proved faithful to God and His excruciatingly painful command, to the benefit of their and Jacob's descendants to this day. Thank you, and Shana Tova.